The 200 to 500 f5.6 rumored lens. All right, so the 200 to 500 millimeter focal length, that's the first thing we want to talk about. We want to talk about this focal length because who is this lens for? You can't just walk around with a 200 to 500 and expect to be a normal or average photographer. You gotta have a reason to have such a long focal length around you at any given time. Now, there are no cheap variations to the 200 to 500. You have the 100 to 400 RF, and you have a couple of other 500 variants, but they're all going to look like a big white lens. And going from 200 to 500, this is definitely a pro lens. Nobody walking around with this lens is going to pay less than $1,000 for this lens. Usually, no matter what aperture you're at, you're always going to be paying over $1,000, $2,000 for a lens. These types of lenses always cost more than a camera. So if you're expecting this 200 to 500 millimeter lens, no matter what aperture it is, to cost less than $1,000, hang it up. Canon charged $699 for 100 to 400 f5.6 to 7.1 aperture lens. So it's kind of like you shouldn't expect to pay no less than $3,000 for a lens like this. And this lens is akin to the 100 to 300 2.8 for the design, the amount of light it lets in. It's closer to that amount. They're talking about, and this is rumored, guys, f5.6 constant aperture lens. It's probably going to be a little bit smaller than the 100 to 300, but I don't know the exact physics going from 200 to 500 because the further you're away from the sensor, I think the idea is the more light you need to let in per distance away from the sensor at some point. So it's definitely going to be a pretty big lens, and if Canon is making a pretty big lens, they're probably going to weather seal it, making an L lens, because it's not really worth making or mass producing a lens that's 200 to 500 and it not being sealed and pro level, and it's going to be pro price too. I'm thinking somewhere around $3,500 plus. So take that in stride. And then who is this for again? This is not just for pros, but pros that shoot wildlife. Some pros that shoot sports, but you're going to have another body because 200 is a little close for most sports. I figured if a sports photographer is sitting on the sidelines of any football outdoor sport specifically, they're going to need at least 100 millimeters full frame or a little bit wider to compensate for that. For example, football, soccer, and stuff like that. And then they need to be able to zoom in from there. So I would think this is a little bit tight on the 200 millimeter end for sports. You need to have at least 100 millimeter full frame. And then 500 is perfect. Zooming into 500 is perfect. So that would encompass most sports, going from anywhere from, I want to say, 70 to 500 millimeters. Encompasses most sports. When you're outside and you're far away from the subjects, you're able to be flexible enough to get a moving subject coming close to you, a ball coming close to you, but also compensating for where you might have to be or where you might not have control to be. So most of the time they might keep you in one area or one spot, and you might have to compete with other photographers. So zooming is very, very, very useful for sports photographers, especially if you're a photographer for the Olympics. But at 200 millimeters, I'm assuming that those people are probably going to have a body that's separate. If you know your exact distance from the subject and you know where the subject is going to be at all times throughout the entire game or the entire situation, then you might not need a second body. But you're probably going to need a second body if you don't know what to expect if you're rolling with the 200 to 500. And this lens is probably going to weigh a lot of pounds, so a monopod. So you're going to be compensating for this in some kind of a way, a tripod, monopod, to keep that weight off of you for a long period of time if you cannot hold it, especially at an aperture of 5.6. Typically, the aperture denotes how wide the lens is, not just aperture-wise, but how wide the actual lens physically is. The bigger the lens, the more light it lets in. The same thing with the sensor. The bigger the sensor, the more light per settings it lets in. So 2.8 on a full frame sensor lets in less light than 2.8 on a medium format sensor, or 2.8 on a full frame sensor lets in more light than a micro four thirds camera at 2.8. Now, sensor technology is great and it compensates for those things, but you have to compensate for those things sensor-wise, but also compensate for those things lens-wise. But lens is more of a physical thing, and it's going to be weight in which you're going to have to be compensating for. Notice how the 50mm f 1.2 is a lot heavier than the 50mm f1.8. And that's not even a different focal length. It's just differences in maximum aperture. The same thing goes for telephoto lenses. As a matter of fact, telephoto lenses get more heavier or heavier, even though they're not as wide of apertures. Like 3.5 at 500 millimeters looks a lot heavier than 3.5 at 105 millimeters. F1.2 at 500 millimeters looks a lot heavier than F1.2 at 50 millimeters. So that's something to think about, the physics of all of this, and what are you going to be doing with this lens over a long period of time. 5.6 as a constant aperture is great. It's not the ideal. If I can get 200 to 500 at 2.8, that will be perfect. But that takes a lot of weight, a lot of time, a lot of effort to make and mass produce. So I'm not expecting Canon to be able to do that or anytime soon. I'm pretty sure they probably designed something like that before, but never mass produced because not a lot of people are going to be able to afford to buy it, and they might not be able to afford to make it at that mass production scale. It'll be a niche lens that people will want to get, but I don't think a lot of people need that. And all of this is a standards ratio. And what I mean by a standards ratio, people are going to, like supply and demand. If a lot of people are not demanding it, then Canon won't supply it. And if the supply, the tools to make it are not available and people can't afford to supplement Canon making, then they won't make it. But technology is getting better per the amount of money that they have to spend to make these things. So that's why these niche lenses come up, where it's different from anything that they've ever made before, because usually it's like a 100 to 400 that they come out with, and that's standard. But the better the technology gets, then now they can come out with a 200 to 500 at f5.6 and still manage the amount of money to actually sell to the masses at a mass-produced rate. And I probably won't make as many of these lenses, but it's enough for people to be able to be like, okay, I'm going to get my lens in a certain amount of time. But Canon has also had an issue with shipping things out, like the R5 Mark II was delayed. I think the R1 was delayed as well. And so most of these niche new lenses are delayed because the supply is low. And Canon usually doesn't have the amount of supply that you need by the time you're ready to purchase it. So what other things can be photographed with the 200-500? Birds in flight, wildlife. 500 millimeters is not necessarily the longest focal length you can use for wildlife, because when you're on safari, when you're doing things, National Geographic birds, you're never close enough. And even if you're close enough for that at 600 millimeters full frame, then you might need to be getting closer to the moon for astrophotography. But astrophotography can also be very wide if you're getting the stars. So it just depends on what you're photographing, but 500 millimeters is good enough for most people, for most ranges. And if you're using that 200 to 500 millimeter 5.6 on a crop frame lens, it becomes even more telephoto. So this is going to be a very interesting focal length to use, especially on crop frame sensors, because 500 millimeters crop frame at a brighter aperture of 5.6 constant throughout the range is a new frontier for most people. And it's exciting to see what Canon's coming out with these new telephoto lenses, and the more they come out with, you have to think that they're going to shave off the price of some of the older telephoto lenses. And you can also go the EF route if you can't get the 500 millimeters on the RF route because of the price. You can go the EF route and you can get a 500 millimeter, I think F4. You can also get a 100 to 400 millimeter. These are slightly cheaper lenses, but they still really retain their value because a lot of people don't purchase them, and they're really niche lenses that Canon don't really get rid of a lot. But don't break them, because it's going to be an arm and a leg to fix them as far as the cost is concerned. But what do you think? Do you guys need a 200 to 500 millimeter? I mean, it's a nice lens because it's wide as 200 millimeters, but 200 millimeters is definitely a niche focal length. A lot of people don't really need more than 200 millimeters, especially if you're shooting portraits and, you know, events and stuff like that. You can really compensate if you're not close enough with 200 millimeters. 70 to 200 is a staple and probably one of the most famous focal lengths to have as far as zoom lenses are concerned. But 200 to 500 is nice too. It's a very nice, and it seems in my eyes to be a worthwhile lens to make. But to afford, if you're not a pro, I'm not so sure. My name is Devin with Century FX Studios TV. Links in the description below. Our new Cash App. Links to other devices that I've used on this channel. And stay tuned for the next video.